No, the RS-3 in the middle of this train isn't a helper engine. After switching an online lumber yard, the crew simply shut down the RS-3 on the main line. They know today's train had to pick it up, if only to get past the switch. Bucolic and laid back, Battenkill connects with Gilbert Transportation and CP Rail at Eagle Mills, New York. In 1994, the Northeastern New York Railroad Preservation Group acquired the tracks used by the Battenkill. The organization began operating an excursion train called the Battenkill Rambler from Salem to Cambridge, New York. With an RS-3 at each end of the train, excursions run from the beginning of July to the end of October. Speaking of tourists, Carrollton Oneida Minerva runs excursions over 14 miles of Wheeling and Lake Erie track between Carrollton and Minerva, Ohio. The trips take about 3 hours, including a 1-hour layover in Minerva. They run on Saturdays and Sundays, mid-June through October. The railroad is nicknamed the Elderberry Line, after the abundant local flora. Built in 1952, RS-3 603's history includes stints on the D&H, Spencerville and Elgin, and the Vermont Railway. Another RS-3 found a home on the Railroad Museum of New England. Established in Thomaston, Connecticut in 1968, the museum formed the Naugatuck Railroad as its operating subsidiary some 2 decades later.
The Railroad Museum of New England owns and operates the Naugatuck Railroad, which is a 19-mile scenic and excursion line running between Waterbury and Torrington, Connecticut, on New Haven's old Naugatuck line. It was originally built in 1849 between Bridgeport and Winsted, Connecticut. The railroad is really the biggest operating exhibit of the Railroad Museum of New England, and whose mission is to preserve and interpret railroad history and railroad artifacts of the New England region.
Today, the railroad runs 18-mile round-trip excursions from Thomaston south along the Naugatuck River to Waterville, just north of Waterbury. The route was built by the original Naugatuck Railroad, later part of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, otherwise known as the New Haven.
This is a post-industrial area. See this place over here? This was Chase Brass. This place got 10 cars of coal a day just for the power plant. That doesn't count the raw materials and the finished products out. In the early 60s, Waterville took a switch engine out of downtown Waterbury Yard, and they spent 6 hours just working Waterville. There was so much stuff in Waterville. Torrington was busy, but all that stuff is gone, and there is no real freight. Alco RS3 529 was one of 62 RS2s and 3s at the New Haven ordered starting in 1948. They used those locomotives to dieselize lines like the Naugatuck in the 1948 to 1950 era. 529 was built in August 1950, and when it came out of Schenectady, it came to the Naugatuck line. We have plenty of pictures of the 529 working this line at different stages in its operating career. In 1959, it and a number of other New Haven locomotives that were stored out of service. New Haven was not a rich railroad and got to the point where it couldn't even afford to repair its locomotives. 529 and a couple of others were shipped back to Alco for a factory rebuild, and it came back in May of '59, painted the way that you see it now, the way that we have it painted now, and reconfigured with a 26 brake system. So the way that the locomotive is the way it was in 1959. 529 is everyone's favorite locomotive here. It's the mascot, it's the pet. Every engineer, of the 3 road locomotives that we run here, every engineer really loves the 529. You open up that throttle and she goes. She doesn't think about it like the GP9, or thinking about it like the U25. For the first year and a half that we ran this railroad, 529 was the only locomotive that we had over here. And we never gave up a train because of a road failure, a mechanical failure on the 529. There were quite a few Saturday nights we were here till 1 o'clock working on something to make sure that she'd run the next day, but she always ran the next day.
One of the hardest working RS3s in America belongs to the Delaware-Lakawanna. The DL is a division of Genesee Valley Transportation, which also owns the Mohawk, Adirondack, and Northern. See later show. Delaware-Lakawanna itself operates a cluster of lines around Scranton, Pennsylvania, and does local switching.